I think that Ozu is the greatest director ever to work in the history of cinema. And if I had to choose his competitor, it would be Mizoguchi. And if I lived on a desert island, I would just take all their films with me and that would be fine. That's cinema as far as I'm concerned. And I think he's making great films from almost the start of his career. I don't think we find a steady ascent towards perfection and then a falling off like we do find in some directors. I don't think we find that zigzag up and down that we find in many great directors like John Ford. I think this guy had the hottest hand of anybody. I can't imagine a film by Ozu I would actively call bad. To me, he was working at a level of brilliance that no other filmmakers had, because he has everything. He works in a commercial cinema. He works for mass audience, producers, budgets, the whole thing, with traditional genres. He works with stars that everybody knows and that many other directors worked with. So he's completely immersed in commercial cinema, at the same time as he makes films that directors who work in a much more rarefied way with more elite audiences and more esoteric ideas and more complicated conceptions of their role never reach. This guy did it all. He is the fulfillment, for me, he's the fulfillment of the potential of cinema. The Ozu that we know of from the post-war films is much closer to these two films than what we see when we look at the earlier films, the silent films especially. There are certainly Ozu-like moments, what we think of as that prototypical post-war Ozu in those films, but there's a much more comic dimension to them, often a sillier slapstick dimension to them. And by the time he gets to The Only Son, he has obviously decided to focus much more on pathos. And though there is comedy in both The Only Son and There Was a Father, the comedy is much more around the edges and giving shading to what is essentially a much more somber story. So the senses, I think, that we think of as the mature Ozu is kind of prefigured in those two films.
A lot of the surviving films, at least, are these college comedies, which are told almost entirely from the points of view of the young men involved. And you see their girlfriends, but you very seldom see their parents. And you see that they're messing up and not studying and that sort of thing, but you never see the consequences for their families. And he starts a transition, I think, with Woman of Tokyo, where suddenly you see the sister who is supporting the student, and it becomes much more somber because she is sacrificing for him. And then when you get to The Only Son, you finally see a parent who is sacrificing a great deal. You really don't see parents sacrificing that much, at least in the surviving films, because when you start to have parents and their children, as in Passing Fancy, and in Tokyo, certainly in Passing Fancy, the father is not suffering. He's a somewhat comic figure, somewhat pathetic figure, but it's almost as if there are two children there. And then in Tokyo is so much concentrated on the social situation imposed from without, and struggling against poverty. But when you get to Only Son, you have the sacrificing mother who discovers that all her sacrifices have not exactly been in vain, but have led to a situation that's far less than she expected for her boy, who has dropped out of school and become this night school teacher. So it's, I think the point of view has shifted dramatically, and I don't think he goes back, really. You'll always see the family either as a whole or the parent and child as they interact. It's always going to be families from this point on.
It seems to me the later 30s he's experimenting more, but experimenting in a different way, because you could argue he was experimenting in the early films too. But by films like Mother Should Be Loved and in Tokyo, and certainly by the time of The Only Son, he's exploring this more intense parent-child relationship that is sometimes there in some of the surviving films, but it's secondary. Whereas in the later 30s, he starts to play with different possibilities. He's got this very pathetic film, The Only Son. Then he's got a kind of reversion to the comic mode with What Did the Lady Forget?, which is not a college comedy, really. It's a family or domestic comedy set among the upper class. And then you have Brothers and Sisters, the Toda family, which is also a sort of upper middle class milieu, which has strong comic touches, but also is about the politics of the extended family, with different characters interacting with parents in different ways. And then you have There Was a Father. And all of these are quite different films, it seems to me. So I see a kind of period of him trying out different narrative templates, different milieus, but coming down finally on either the smaller family, like There Was a Father, and the only son, or the more extended family in Toda family. And he's trying out this new thematic material, I think, of the family and what he can do with it, either comically or tragic pathetically.
な、母やんはな、お目には隠していたけんど、在後には平うちはねえんだよ。父やが残さしゃったうちも桑畑も、もうみんな平うちまって、母やんはお目には黙っていたけんど、今じゃ縄手の交番の長屋にいるんだし。けんどそんなことはどうだってええだ。おめえしっかりしていてくれりゃ、母やんはうちだって畑だってそんなものは兄もいりゃしねえだ。母やんはおめっきりが頼りなんだし、済んだのにそんな気で言ってくれたんじゃ。
The Only Son's a dark film, and one of his darkest films of this period, I think, partly because he's taking on some issues that have been in the background of the earlier films, but are now coming to the forefront. A lot of the comedies, the college comedies, the workplace films, even the gangster films, a couple of sort of gangster films he made, are about Japan and the Depression. They're about urban Japan and the troubles and struggles people have to make ends meet. They sort of pull through those through common humanity, and they have a certain sort of resilience to them, the characters in these films, like Passing Fancy. But by the time he gets to The Only Son, and of course the Depression has deepened, I think there's a more deep reflection on what's been called the failures of the Meiji Revolution, when Japan modernized at the end of the 19th century and quickly adopted all kinds of Western ways, from large-scale industrial production, military warfare, popular culture, Western popular culture. All these things are flowing into Japan and being modified and transformed by the local culture. And there's a kind of optimism about that before the Depression hits at the end of the 20s. There's a kind of sense that Japan can catch up with the West in its own idiosyncratic way. And part of that involves success and the idea that if you work hard and really try and put everything you have into it, and especially get an education, you can succeed. What happens in these college films and the urban comedies is that that doesn't pay off. That people who've worked hard or have tried to get through school and so forth, they can't find a job, or they can't succeed in their job. This is all what is happening at the moment. This is socially referential. This is what's going on. In the meantime, okay, if that's the foundation, what's happening in the city? Are people prospering there? Well, the Tokyo we see is not a very pleasant place. If you compare the look of Tokyo in this film with the way it looks in the earlier films, it's completely different. This is a wasteland. This is an industrial dumping ground with these tenements slammed out against this, just pasted against this desolate landscape of garbage factories and processing plants and so on. I mean, when she goes to Tokyo and she goes into the standard tourist shrines and spots, we don't see those. You know, Tokyo is really a bleak place in this film. And that's so different from the way Tokyo was characterized in the earlier films as a place of fun and gaiety, and young people can kind of have romances in this milieu. It's not there anymore. So the countryside, no prospects. The city, no prospects, and it isn't even glamorous anymore. To me, this is the most sort of direct foregrounding, you might say, of Ozu's, what's been in the background up till now, but which is really quite up front, which is the failure of modern Japan.
It does strike me that even though we see these films reflecting the society of the day and the problems of the day in a sort of implicitly critical way, I don't think they're political in the sense that we think of political films as offering some sort of solution or suggestion as to what people might do in response. It's just try harder, don't give up. You know, and you have to assume when the son, and the only son, finally does say, I am going back to school, I'm going to get my certificate, I'm going to try to get a better job, he may not be able to do it. So there is a sense that the political situation is just insuperable for these people, and the same kinds of disappointments after World War II that appear in his films are there not for political reasons. So I think, in a way, he's using the political situations to create these family dramas and these comedies and so on. But I don't think he's really suggesting much of anything that could be done by the characters.
I think one of the reasons we don't think of Ozu as inherently a political filmmaker, a social commentator, is the fact that there's an aestheticization of everything. I mean, it's not to say that he glamorizes poverty or but he does make whatever milieu the film is set in beautiful. And that doesn't factor into our conception of political filmmaking. I mean, poverty should look horrible. Poverty looks in its own way elegant in Ozu films. The countryside, for instance, the home, the use of the lanterns and the windows in the beginning of The Only Son, these are aesthetically extremely striking. And even the factory takes on this kind of massive beauty to it. And there's a way in which I think that blocks our thinking of Ozu as making a criticism, because everything gets kind of transformed by this unique vision that he has. But I do think that if you actually look at the films, particularly the films that are about these economic conditions in the 30s and the parent-child relationship at different social classes, there is a pretty strong political implication, we might say, to them. And he's, I think, aware of that, even though he himself is, not particularly concerned to pass along a political message. The only case in which it does work, I think, rather well is There Was a Father, where you might argue it's like one of the greatest propaganda films ever made, because it still has that exquisiteness that we associate with Ozu, but there the political message is really quite upfront, and quite different, of course, from the message that we would take away from The Only Son, I think.
Well, one interesting thing is that even though there is the social commentary in this film, once he gets to the post-war period, his films continue this notion of the disappointments of life, that inevitably when the children leave, the parents will be if they're widowed, as in Late Spring and Late Autumn, they'll be left alone. And you see in Late Autumn, the ending is in some ways rather similar to the ending of The Only Son, because you get this woman sitting alone, facing a life of loneliness. The woman in Late Autumn, of course, is more prosperous. She's not going to be living in a factory. You see, in each case, the woman alone, and then there's a cut to the environment, and you get this rather cheerful, or even in the case of Late Autumn, somewhat triumphal music. And there's this notion that they are sacrificing it, that there is something very admirable about this. They're facing loneliness for their children. So the idea that it's just the poverty that causes this kind of grim situation at the end is, I think, not entirely Ozu doing social commentary, but talking about or showing the disappointments of life that will continue into his later films when he's talking about more prosperous people.
The economic problems have pretty much gone away in the later Ozu. There are occasionally films that deal with the working class or lower middle class life, but people are generally more prosperous in the later films. But this same tragedy that begins with a relationship between parent and child, that title that begins The Only Son, is definitely there in the later films, kind of cut away from its economic moorings. Then it's something that's just more inherent in the very relationship, regardless of the social milieu.
It's amazing how little information we get about the father in this family, who is dead, obviously, but the situation that the family is in seems to be a mill. They're living in a mill, and it looks like a fairly large building that is now somewhat derelict. So their family must have been in better circumstances earlier on, and the death of the father has clearly, if it hasn't caused the mill to close, it's at least forced the wife into a situation where she's having to do this very menial work. So it's a very reticent film in setting up this kind of situation, and I don't recall that as being quite as obvious a technique that Ozu used in earlier films.
It's a fascinating, I think, play with point of view in the film, because we start with mother and the child, and then the child is allowed to go away, and we see the mother in 1935. She's been separated from him a long time, but we're with the mother. We don't follow the boy. And we only find out that he's built himself a whole life in Tokyo when the mother does. So in a way, the first part of the film, first 20 minutes or so, confines you really to her point of view. And so Ozu is being rather stingy with this kind of information. But then when we get in Tokyo and they both share experiences, he starts to manipulate the story so that we see her and we see him. We see her, we see him. And sometimes, of course, they're together, as when they visit Okubo's pork cutlet restaurant or when they go out to the desolate flats there by the garbage processing plant. And then this kind of sharing or balancing of point of view, you're with one, with the other. You see him try to borrow money to show her a good time. We see him talk with his wife about whether we can afford to take her out and so forth. And then we see her alone, musing on things or fondling the baby and so forth. And then what happens when the business with Tomio and his being kicked by the horse happens, and she gets to see him as a kindly man, even though a kind of a failure, that seems to be one of the epiphanies of the film. A lot of films would leave it there, but instead we get two extended epilogues, it seems to me. One with the boy. After she's gone away, we stay with the boy in Tokyo now. We don't follow her on the train going back. And the son is looking at his baby and looking particularly at the baby's bottle and thinking, I really must try harder. And so forth. So in a way, we get to see much more about him now than we had seen in the beginning part of the film, and how this longing for this relationship with his mother has really taken over, and seeing her again, tied to the shame of not being able to deliver what he'd hoped. But then we get a second epilogue of her. And many films would have stopped and said, look, you're a good man. I don't care if you're poor. You're a good man. But she does kind of care. At the end of the film, she's sitting there, and she tells her friend, of course, she's very proud of him. But then we see they're sitting there in what looks like a prison, basically, a prison yard with even barbed wire over the top of the gate. And you realize she really, although it's very opaque, we don't really know what she's thinking. There's a sense of like, what has this been worth it? So the film is fascinating in kind of balancing out these two principal characters' attitudes towards a central situation. There's very little drama in the film. There's very little forward action. It's a series of revelations of minor key things. Oh, you have a wife and child. Oh, you teach in a night school. But once that's there, there's really no forward progression except provided by these parallels, these other characters in similar situations. The younger mother, the neighbor, with a boy of her own. Okubo with his wife and two children. And it's the discovery of these parallel situations which are reflections of, or somewhat analogous to, the situations that we have in the central part of the film. That's the drama of the film, is the discovery of these parallels and the growing realization on the part of the two main characters of all these dramatic implications of their situation. That's a very unusual narrative structure. Even for Ozu at that time, it's a rather unusual structure, I think. Ozu by now has gotten, this is his first sound feature. He's made a short until now. But by now he's got this rhythm that he's established of a kind of sideways entry into action. Instead of an establishing shot of the town, and then establishing shot of the factory, and then an establishing shot of the factory floor, we start with a lantern and a window. And Ozu loves windows because it's an ambiguous transition. A window can say the next scene is going to take place inside because you're looking out and the camera's on the inside, or the next scene is going to take place on the outside because the window shows you the outdoors. And he loves to do things like this. So this opening shot is a kind of pivot that can go in either direction. But then he takes us outdoors, he takes us down the street, the women who are apparently bringing silkworms to the factory for processing. We get those shots of the women walking, and then finally we get to the factory. And then only after we've had the dialogue between Otsune and her friend, we cut back to show the town. Those kinds of things. That's Ozu. Ozu's been doing this in films for a long time up to this point. But now he's got it really refined so that each one of these shots is setting what happens next. The shot actually itself creates a kind of visual suspense. Where will I go next? Where is this hooking to? I see where it's hooked from, but where is it hooking to? The same thing in the city where the tenement, particularly the space of Ryusuke's house, is given a kind of elaboration, a visual elaboration that maybe other people would spend on landscapes, or Ozu himself would have spent on cityscapes. He puts into all these little decals and clippings that people have put on the wall. Picture Joan Crawford, at least I think it's Joan Crawford, or the Germany poster with the horse on it. All those little cutouts of kabuki figures and star pictures and all these things sort of pasted at different levels along the walls. This kind of minutiae of urban life, you know, is fascinating to him, and he will build his spaces out of that, as he has done in earlier films. But now I think it's really about characterizing the household. It's about how these people spend their time. They've still got these little pieces of popular culture floating around inside their house. This is a very typical film stylistically for Ozu. And the structure of the film, I think, is a little more rigorous maybe. The architecture is a little more strict than we've had in some of the other films, with this very distinct time gap period. Something he didn't do very much, is have these big gaps of time. And it gives the film a much more systematic sort of parallels. So we can trace Atsune's decline into being a scrub woman. We can trace the development of her relationship to her son in pretty, almost schematic ways.
I think some of the parallels, though, are to other films. I mean, you see parallels in The Only Son, but then you see things that echo other films. So the lamp motif echoes Woman of Tokyo, for example, where the lamp is in the window is quite prominent. But also one of the most striking ones that he uses to characterize the outskirts of Tokyo is this big empty cable, the giant drums that obviously cable came on and now they've just been discarded and they're lying around the landscape, and big empty, presumably empty tanks in the background. He uses those over and over again, and it becomes a sort of shorthand for this kind of desolation of Tokyo. You get them all through an inn in Tokyo, where that's basically where the father and his two sons hang out in that film. And it just, you get these echoes building up as you see more Ozu films from this period. So there's a sort of resonance about them that I don't think they'd have on their own.
And by now, of course, he's got sound. So as we move into the factory, you get this thudding, kind of percussive pulse, which is we're going to hear in a variant when we're in the tenement with Ryusuke and his family. And this kind of bap, 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 day and night, this kind of, presumably a workman making shoes or making metal work or something like that. Often in these films we don't know, but that kind of steady pulse gives the film this kind of deliberate rhythm that you get set up at the outset, but also through these sidelong spaces.
The final scene is quite impressive in its use of a counterpoint between the music and the mood of the scene, the overt mood of the scene, where the mother is sitting there very desolate and depressed and facing this life of loneliness. And you get this cheerful music on the soundtrack, which is very different from what we would expect in a film, especially a film by somebody who hasn't worked with sound before very much.
Ozu's career, when he uses music of that sort, there's often a kind of sprightly quality to the music he puts over pretty grim scenes. And there's almost a sense that the music clashes with the tone of the scene, to the point where you think that maybe the music is trying to get you to see something positive in the scene. That is that, and I think that's sort of the end with the old Black Joe as he edges away. And just as the beginning of the film is sort of moved sidelong into Atsune's story, then it moves away from her in this kind of sidestepping manner to the gate. And the music, as the camera's positions change, the cuts, the music becomes more sprightly and more light in a way. So you have this final image of the gate, seen from quite low, with the dust kind of coming down on it. And it's kind of a prolonged lyrical passage in the music. It's a little somber, but not anywhere near as grim as it might be, a heavily dramatic scene. So I think in this early film he is experimenting a bit with how music can kind of nuance the tone of the scene. The drama and the visuals can kind of be offset a little bit by music that isn't completely out of keeping, but gives a little bit of shading to the scene. And all these things, he just blends them so effortlessly. He makes it look easy, which is why it's taken us so long, I think, to come to understand how good he is, because he makes it look so unbelievably easy. That's not to say there aren't many, many great directors, but he's in a special place, I think.